Delighted to see you tonight. I'm going to do something I characteristically don't do, and that is I'm going to make two or three announcements. I would rather just start preaching, but there are two or three things we need to talk about. You noticed this morning or this evening that we began with a verse of a song, and we're going to do that going forward at each service. We're going to begin with the verse of a song before we have our announcements. And the reason for that, it kind of calls us to order. We love the fact that people are running around talking, visiting. That's great. That says something about the life of the church. But it is often very hard for the elder who's in charge of making announcements and leading the shepherd's prayer to get everybody's attention. So we're just going to say, when you hear the song start on Sunday morning or Sunday evening, just going to be the verse of a song or so. That means get in your seat, get ready, be quiet, and one of the elders is going to come up and make announcements. We just think that's an orderly way to do it. And I think that was suggested by our brother Chris. And Chris, we thank you. That was a very good suggestion. And the elders immediately said, that's a good idea, so we're going to do that. The second thing is that it seems that no matter how hard we try, we cannot get announcements made in an effective way. I think we do a better job than most congregations on that. On the one hand, we put them in the bulletin. On the other hand, we make them all verbally. And still, someone will say to us, I didn't know anything about that. We're going to do what? When? And so we're going to try to do a better job in getting that done. Now, we can only go so far. Short of coming to your house and reading the bulletin to you, there's only so much we can do. But we're going to do everything we can. If you're going to submit an announcement, please do so early enough for the elder who's going to be making the announcements to get it and read it over. And if there's any question, to ask you the questions. We get questions, please pray for my niece Susie. And we don't know who you are. Who are you that wants us to pray for your niece Susie? We don't know. We don't have any idea. So put your name on it that you're making the announcement. Tell us what you need us to know about the announcement. Now, we cannot tell every detail. If we did, it would take about 5 bulletins to put it all in on Sunday morning because people give us all of the details. It's their left shoulder. It's broken in 7 places. One of them is at the elbow. The other one's at the wrist. It's a large index finger. I mean, it's just like, we don't have room for all that, folks. Please be reasonable with us. Give us what we need to know. And please put that in advance and give it to one of our elders. It's hardly fair to them to get an announcement walking down the aisle and they've never had a chance to read it. And so they have to stand up here and try to read it and then make it, and they're not really sure what it's about. So give it early enough, complete enough, that they can ask you questions if they need to, and then they can get up and give them in an orderly way. And I'm going to try very hard to get everything I can in the bulletin. Please read the bulletin. Do you know that you can get it online? Do you know we publish the bulletin online every week? On Friday, Rusty publishes it. All you have to do is to go to our website. It's really hard. SeymourCoc.org. SeymourCoc.org. And there's a little tab up there that says Publications. If you click on Publications, they will fall down, and you just have to go to the one for the date. That way you can read the announcements. Man, you can read on the back if you have anything to do that Sunday. And that way, if you have a reading, you can know all about it. We're going to work hard at getting you to know that that information is there on our website. And so is our directory, by the way. I still get questions. Somebody calls me, can you tell me where so and so lives and what their phone number is? Do you know it's on our webpage? I get two answers. No, really? And the other one is, yeah, I know, but I don't have time to look it up. Could you tell me? And it's like, I've got time to look it up, but you don't? Okay. SeymourCoc.org, publications. It'll fall down and it'll give you all of the bulletins of this year and the last 2 or 3 years, as a matter of fact. One more thing. One of the things that we are contemplating on Sunday nights is to have a Pew Packers class. Now, you may not have any idea what a Pew Packers class is, but that's getting the children together on the front seat or the first couple of seats and having songs and Bible drills with them, learning some memory verses. And we think that's a way to draw our young people even further into what we're trying to do. And what we want to know from parents, if we do that on Sunday night, say at 5:30, would you make a very special effort to get your children here? Because it'll be kind of disappointing if I get all ready for that and I come and there's nobody that shows up. I love our kids. I really do. I love them dearly. And I think they love me. Contrary to what others think, they think I'm a good preacher. And it just amazes me how bright they are at that age and how much they really know. So if you are a parent and you have children that would be in a class like that, let me know. Tell me, Tom, we'll get our kids there and we'll do our best with them. We'll let you know when it's going to start, if it's going to start, but it depends upon your involvement. Well, enough announcements. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 20. And I want to read verses 8 through 11. It's on the screen. You may want to follow along in your own Bible. This is the fourth commandment. Now, keep in mind that the first four have to do with man's relationship to God. The last six have to do with man's relationship to man. So this is the last of the relationship with God commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gate. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This is one of the commandments that we've been afraid to talk about. As a matter of fact, I'm doing the 10 Commandments with my Boost program that I record on Tuesday morning, the little 5-minute snippet of encouraging words. And I mentioned in the very first one that I believe there was something for us to learn from every one of the 10 Commandments. And had a lady who responded to me, and she was kind enough, but she just wanted me to know that she disagreed with me. Because she said that fourth commandment, that observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, is not binding on us today. Don't you know that? And I responded very politely and said, yes, I do, by the way. And I'm not trying to say it's binding. I'm trying to say that there's an application in it for us today. All I'm saying is there's an application to be made today. I think the application is about how we use our time. Now, you tuck that away because we're going to be coming back to that. But I think the takeaway for us in this fourth commandment is that God says, I want you to use your time wisely. And a part of using your time wisely is making sure that you have a day for rest and worship. That's the takeaway. Now, there are many people who would have considered this the greatest commandment. You may remember that in the Talmud there were 613 commandments. The rabbis didn't have much to do that day, and so they sat around and counted all of them. And they even decided which ones were positive and which ones were negative. And by the way, they had 365 negative commandments, one for every day of the year, I guess. And the balance of them were positive. And then they liked to sit around and discuss which ones of them were heavy announcements or heavy commandments and which ones of them were light commandments. Like if you're going to break one, make sure it's a light commandment. Don't dare break one of those heavy commandments. And then on top of all of that, they said, we want to know which one's the greatest. Do you know that many of the rabbis believed this was the greatest commandment? If you had said, Brother Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the law, he would have said, well, in the Talmud, we have 613 commandments. And the greatest of all of those is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now, Jesus didn't think so. Because in Matthew 22, when he was asked what is the greatest commandment in the law, his answer, you remember, was, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, for this is the first and greatest commandment. Quoting the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. And he said, the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But the Sabbath was a very particularly important command to the Jewish people. The word Sabbath means rest or cessation. That's the meaning of the word. The Sabbath day was to be a particular day of rest. Now, it came also to be a day where you worshiped, but it was begun primarily as a day of rest, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. It reminded the Jews of God's rest. It was based upon that, because verse 11, if you remember, in Exodus chapter 20 says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. So it was patterned after the fact that God took a day of rest. Now that doesn't mean he was tired from creating for 6 days. I can't imagine that God, who is omnipotent, who is omnipotent, who has all power, would say, man, those 6 days wore me out. I need a good nap. I don't believe that he needed it for the purpose of recouping. I believe he needed it as an example to us that you can't work 7 days a week. It's not good for you. And so you need a day of cessation. You need a day of rest. You need a day when you take it easy. And so we need a day for rest, for cessation, for the purpose of taking it easy. Now, the Jews were dead serious about the Sabbath day. And you've heard the term hedging around the Torah. Have you heard that term before? And here's what it means. The Torah is the word for law. And so here's the law. And so they were so afraid that somebody would break the law that they would go back here and build a hedge around it so you didn't get close to breaking the law. The next rabbi would come up and say, well, that's not far enough away. We'll build a hedge back here around it. And the next one would say, we'll build a hedge back here. And they were so far removed from the Torah, from the law itself, that they didn't even know what it was about. And as a matter of fact, when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 said, you have heard it said, And then he quoted what had been said. But I say unto you, you know what he was talking about? He was talking primarily about what people had made as they hedged around the Torah. He was not talking about a proper understanding of the law. He was talking about what the rabbis had done with the law and how they had added everything to it. There was a requirement in regard to the Sabbath of no work. Exodus 35 and verse 2. Well, if God didn't work on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is in remembrance or was in remembrance of what God did, in likeness of what God did, then the Jews were not to work on the Sabbath day. So guess what they had to figure out? What was work and what wasn't. And they got clear ridiculous with it. As a matter of fact, they had 39 categories where they defined work. And in each of those categories, there were subpoints. It was like, you're not smart enough to figure out what work is, so we're going to tell you what work is. And so they said, you can't cook, you can't travel, you can't gather wood, you can't build a fire, you can't even tie a knot. Now, how much work is that, tying a knot? They did say, however, you could tie a knot in your shoes, because they had to make that exception. You can't buy anything or sell anything. You can't carry a load of anything anywhere. You can't bear a burden. And it went on getting plumb ridiculous, because they were trying to say, here is what work is, and you're not supposed to work. You can't figure it out, so we're going to tell you what it is. If you were a tailor, now, not a maiden name, okay, but if you were a tailor who made your living sewing, you couldn't even take your needle home over the Sabbath. You know why? You might be tempted to sew a button on, and that would be work. Perish the thought. And they said, if you're a scribe, you can't even take your pen home, because if you have it over the Sabbath, you might be tempted to write a word, and that would be work. Folks, I wonder sometimes if we don't get about that ridiculous with some of the things that we impose on people. Do we ever hedge around the Torah? When I entered college in 1963, there you go, that's when it was. I'd graduated from high school in 1962, went to college in 1963, and a Christian college, and it no longer exists. I guess, Sierra, we closed that thing down. We were so bad they decided they couldn't even have it anymore. Sadly, recently they went bankrupt. But they had to determine what we could wear. It was the days of long hair. So they had to determine how long was long. And so they determined that it could not touch your collar on the back of your neck. Now, for guys with long necks, that's not bad. But if you're like I am, where your head kind of sets down on your neck, any hair I've got back there is going to touch my collar. Okay? But that was the rule. And for the women who wore skirts, and they wanted you to wear skirts or dresses, the dress had to reach the ground or the floor if you were kneeling. So that meant Mrs. Tuttle, who was the dorm mama, if girls were going out someplace and she had any question, they would have to kneel down on the floor and make sure that their dress or skirt reached the ground. Really? Now, I understand that there were people who took advantage of those kind of rules, but it's kind of like we have to add all of this to tell you what to do. We get into situations where we want to tell people who stand before us to serve in some capacity what they have to wear. Really? Or that they can only read out of one particular version that we authorize. I have people who remind me that the King James Bible is authorized because it says it right on the inside page. And I say, yes, it is. Do you know who authorized it? It wasn't God, it was King James. That's why they call it the King James Bible, because he authorized the writing of it, or the copying of it, the translating of it. Had something like 47 scholars who came together to accomplish that purpose. Now, I wish personally that people who read the Scripture for me on Sunday morning would read from the New King James Bible. The only reason I wish that is that's what I preach out of, and that's what I put on the screen. And so if you read from some other translation, it's not going to match what's on the screen, and people are going to say, well, my Bible doesn't say that. But I don't have the right to impose on you that you cannot read from this good version or this good version. Now, I know there are some that aren't worth anything. But could it be that we fall into the same trap where we say to our people, you're not smart enough to figure it out. We're going to tell you exactly what it means, and we expect you to do it. Is that hedging around the Torah? If it was wrong when the scribes did it, when the rabbis did it, is it likewise wrong today? And really, what happened was that there were so many laws regarding the Sabbath that people saw it as a terrible burden to be borne. As a matter of fact, in Mark 2, there's this interesting story of Jesus and his disciples who are going through a grain field on the Sabbath. You remember the story? The law said don't work. So that meant you couldn't go out and thrash grain on the Sabbath. But some of his disciples, as they went through, were picking off the mature heads of the wheat plants. They were rubbing it in their hands. They were getting grains of wheat, and they were eating it. And the religious leaders went to pieces because they said, that's work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Jesus reminded them in verse 27. He said, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. He says, don't get that all mixed up in your head as to what's most important. And he reminded them that David and his men, when they were fleeing, when they were on the run on the lamb, that they went into the temple or tabernacle and ate the showbread that only the high priest were supposed to eat, or only the priests were supposed to eat. And he said, God didn't strike them dead now, did he? Because there was a necessity there, and it was not a violation of the Sabbath any more than picking a few heads of the wheat and rubbing them together in your hands and putting that in your mouth and getting a little bit of nourishment as you went on was a violation of the Sabbath. But the Sabbath became a real burden to people. Now, don't you dare misunderstand me. I'm not saying that anything goes. I'm not saying that we can do anything we want to and God will be pleased. What I'm saying is, let's not make it any more than God makes it. Let's not add anything to it that God didn't add to it. Let's not hedge around the Torah. God didn't, or the Lord didn't appreciate that when Israel did it, and he doesn't appreciate that when we do it. Now, here are some questions. I think here's where it comes into play. First of all, is the Sabbath binding on us today? In a word, no. Now, there are Sabbatarians, Seventh-day Adventists, for instance. There are Seventh-day Churches of God. there are religious groups that still believe that the Sabbath is binding. And that's not so. The Sabbath was a day for Israel. It was in the Ten Commandments, which were given to the Israelites, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment, so stay tuned. But the law was taken out of the way. As a matter of fact, Colossians 2:14 says it was taken out of the way and nailed to the cross. Galatians chapter 3 says it was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, but after we've come to Christ, we're no longer under the schoolmaster. Certainly, the law of Moses was never intended to be permanent, and it's not binding on us at all. Now, and yet I'm preaching a series of sermons on Sunday nights on the Ten Commandments, which are part of the law. Remember what I said at the beginning. It's the principles that I'm interested in. It's the principle that I'm interested in here on the Sabbath day, not saying that the Sabbath day is binding on us. Number 2, is Sunday the Christian Sabbath? No, it's not. It is not. The Sabbath day was Saturday. It can only be Saturday. It's not the first day of the week, which is our day of worship. As a matter of fact, Matthew 28:1, it's the day that Jesus arose from the dead. Acts 2, it's the day the church began on Pentecost. Acts 20 and verse 7, it's the day that the early Christians gathered together to observe the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 16, it's the day that they laid by in stores that had been prospered. And in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, it's the day John said he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day, the first day of the week, is our day of worship. It is not the Sabbath, although I hear good people saying that Sunday's our Sabbath. That's like saying that Sunday is our Saturday. That just doesn't make sense. It's not. It's not binding on us, and it is not our Sabbath day. Sunday, the Lord's Day, is not. The Sabbath day was distinctly and exclusively Jewish. Now, if you've got your Bible open back there in Genesis 20, go over to chapter 31. And I think this is ever so clear if we will just let it speak to us. Verses 16 and 17 of Exodus 31. Now listen carefully. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. Now, he says in verse 16 and in verse 17 that it was a covenant between him and Israel. It's not a covenant between him and us. It was binding on the Jews. And now let me also say this. No rules are given to us regarding to how we observe the Lord's Day other than that we are to worship. Now, my dad didn't get that message because he had his own rules as to what we would do on Sunday. We got a big thick paper with the funny papers in it. And you know the first thing I want to do on Sunday morning was read the funny papers. You know what I couldn't do on Sunday because it was the Lord's Day? I couldn't read the funny papers. We were not allowed to go out and do things that other children were doing on that day. And my reply was always, well, the elders' kids do. And he said, but I'm not an elder, I'm the preacher. You're not an elder's kid, you're a preacher's kid. So you're not going to do it. And I said, yes, Daddy. He had his own particular set of rules as to how we would observe Sunday. He wanted to make sure that if we call it the Lord's Day, that it was the Lord's day. For many families, the Lord is lucky to get an hour out of the day that we call the Lord's Day. And that seems like it just is not right to me. What do you think about that? I don't want to make laws where God has not made them. But doesn't it make sense that if we're going to call it the Lord's Day, that we ought to call it that, meaning that we worship Him on that day and that we take it easy and rest on that day? Remember, the Sabbath was a day of cessation. But I'll tell you what, if I work over Sunday, I get double time and a half. Well, I'm not sure that God is all that concerned about you making double time and a half and His Son not getting an hour. What do you think? I think that He may feel differently about that than many people today feel about that. No, there are not the extensive rules that there were for the Sabbath. But common sense says, the Lord's Day is the Lord's Day. Let's use it for Him. And surely we can think of some things that would help His cause and help refresh us. That would be very fitting and proper on the Lord's Day. Okay, what's the point then? You've told us what it's not. What's the point? I think we ought to use our time wisely. And that a part of using our time wisely on the Lord's Day is that we worship. We're far too stressed out because we try to put too many things on our plate and too many things on our calendar. Somebody commented in our recent meeting that my daytimer, my calendar, is an industrial strength one because it's a great big one. And Sierra and I get together, and she puts her appointments on there, and I put my appointments on there, and we put our appointments on there, and it's like, oh my goodness. And some of you can identify with that. Do you think sometimes we are just too busy? And we forget that we ought to take some time and just take it easy. Somebody asked me how vacation was last week. Now, you'd have to know where we went. If you know where Tellico Plains is, that's where you leave civilization and go to this cabin. Then you get on a narrow road that's paved for a while and turns into gravel. And it has switchbacks that you're going like this, and you're just hoping you don't meet anybody or anything coming down the other way. And the cabin where we were has some pretty steep steps to get up into it, and I have a little problem with that. And so I went into that cabin on Sunday afternoon. We got there about 5 o'clock or so, and I came out Friday morning. And there was really nothing to do. I mean, watch the grass grow. But that was about it. There was nothing to go see. We would have gotten a car and got back on those roads and gone someplace. We didn't want to do that. The Sam and me of we didn't want to do that. The Marty and Sierra of we decided they would venture out one day. And we just took it easy. And it was delightful. It was delightful. We just took it easy. Folks, we need that. We need that. The joke is we go on vacation and we have to go back home and rest up from vacation. Then that hardly makes it a vacation. Vacation is kind of get away and recharge your batteries. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that boy has done quit preaching and gone to meddling right now. But I'm just saying, think about this. Ephesians 5 says that we ought to redeem the time, that we ought to walk circumspectly, looking around, understanding where we are and where we're going. And we ought to use our time wisely. And I think that's so. All work and no play more than makes Jack a dull boy. It wears us out. And it saps not only our physical strength and our mental strength, it can sap our spiritual strength. And so sometimes we just need a cessation, a day of rest to get away. And we have to find the balance there. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 3 said, "For everything there's a season." Well, there is. There's a time to work, but there's also a time to rest. That's what the Sabbath was all about. And that's what the takeaway is all about. Kelly Weber Steinberg wrote these words: "Take my life and let it be consecrated to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. Take my voice and let me sing always only for my King. Take my lips and let them be filled with messages from thee. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold. Take my intellect and use every power as you choose. Here am I, all of me. Take my life, it's all for thee." As you can see, some of the verses of that piece of poetry are in a song that we sing, but that's the complete piece. And we need to understand that here I am, and I belong to the Lord. He expects me to use good common sense in how I use my time. Thank you.